starting chapter 20 of Isaiah. And this is a shorter chapter. I have it titled, The Symbol of Assyrian Victory Over Egypt and Ethiopia. And in verse 1, he says, In the year that Tartan came unto Ashdod, when Sargon the king of Assyria sent him, and fought against Ashdod, and took it. I wonder if that Tartan, is that like tartar sauce? I guess not then. Paul missed it. So before actually going into these verses, I wanted to give some background information that might help us in our understanding of these things. And both of these are rather lengthy, but as I say, it does give some good information as far as background is concerned. First, from the pulpit commentary, it states that the Assyrian inscriptions enable us to date this prophecy with a near approach to exactness. Ashdod was besieged by an Assyrian army twice in the reign of Sargon in his 9th year, BC 713, and in his 11th year, BC 711. On the former occasion, it is probable that the arms of a general, Tartan, were employed. On the latter, it is nearly certain that Sargon made the expedition in person. The capture of Ashdod here mentioned is consequently the first capture. Egypt and Ethiopia were at the time united under one head, Shebak or Shabaktak, and the inhabitants of Ashdod looked to this quarter for deliverance from the Assyrian power. Shortly after the first capture, they revolted, deposed the king whom Sargon had set over them, appointed another, and then proceeded in conjunction with Philistia, Judah, Edom, and Moab to call in the aid of the Egyptians and the Ethiopians. Isaiah's mission on this occasion was to discourage Judah from joining Ashdod and her allies in this appeal. He was instructed to prophesy that Assyria would shortly inflict a severe defeat on the two African powers and carry into captivity large numbers of both nations. The prophecy seems to have had its accomplishment about 12 years later when Sennacherib defeated the combined forces of Egypt and Ethiopia at El-Tekka near Ekron. Then Brother Darrell Conley, he wrote, After years of idolatry and rebellion against God, Israel, the northern kingdom, fell before the soldiers of Assyria. He quotes 2 Kings 15:19, there came against the land Pul, the king of Assyria. So the sacred history announces the downfall of the northern 10 tribes. Pul was a former soldier who in 747 BC ascended the throne of Assyria and was known from that point forward as Tiglath-Pileser III. He was the first of a series of brutal tyrants whose goals were to conquer Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. Israel and Judah I lost my place. Israel and Judah were caught in the middle of this great struggle. Israel and Judah were caught in the middle of this great struggle. Israel and Judah were caught in the middle of this great struggle. Israel and Judah were caught in the middle of this great struggle. Israel and Judah were caught in the middle of this great struggle. Israel and Judah were caught in the middle of this great struggle. At first, Israel voluntarily submitted to Assyria. And he quotes, "And Menahem gave Pul 1,000 talents of silver, that his hand might be with him to confirm the kingdom in his hand. And Menahem exacted the money of Israel, even of all the mighty men of wealth, and of each man 50 shekels of silver, to give to the king of Assyria. So the king of Assyria turned back and stayed not there in the land." That's in 2 Kings 15, verses 19 and 20. In his annals, Tiglath-Pileser recorded, quote, "I received tribute from Menahem of Syria," end quote. But under the leadership of Rezin, king of Damascus, and just as an aside, y'all remember the name Rezin from Isaiah chapter 7? Under the leadership of Rezin, king of Damascus, Israel, Phoenicia, Philistia, Arabia, and Edom joined in an alliance against Assyria. Only Judah refused to join and appealed to Assyria for protection from this new alliance. And then he quotes, "In the days of Pekah, king of Israel, came Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and took Ijon, and Abel-Beth-Maachah, and Genoa, and Kadesh, and Hazor, and Gilead, and Galilee, all the land of Naphtali, and he carried them captive to Assyria. And Hoshea, the son of Elah, made a conspiracy against Pekah, the son of Remaliah, and smote him and slew him, and rejoined in his stead, or reigned in his stead, in the 20th year of Jotham, the son of Uzzah." That's in 2 Kings chapter 15, verses 29 and 30. It says that the annals of Tiglath-Pileser say, quote, "They overthrew Pekah their king, and I made Hoshea to be king over them," end quote. All that was left of the northern kingdom was the capital city of Samaria. When Tiglath-Pileser died, Hoshea rebelled and conspired with Egypt. He refused to pay his tribute to Shalmaneser V, successor to Tiglath-Pileser, struck back. And he quotes again from the Bible, "And the king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. And in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria, and carried Israel away into Assyria, and placed them in Halah on the harbor, the river of Gozan, and the cities of the Medes." 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 4 and verse 6. He continues that we know from cuneiform tablets that Shalmaneser V died suddenly during the siege of Samaria, and was succeeded by Sargon II. Sargon boasts in his annals, quote, "I besieged and conquered Samaria," and continues, "I led away into captivity 27,290 people who lived there," end quote. He ruled from 721 to 705 BC. And the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon, and from Cuthah, and from Ava, and from Hamath, and from Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel. And they possessed Samaria and dwelt in the cities thereof. That's in 2 Kings chapter 17 and verse 24. And then he concludes by saying, here in Isaiah chapter 20 and verse 1, we have the only mention of Sargon's name in the Bible. So that gives you a little bit of I say they were lengthy readings, but gives you some good background as to this chapter, and also gives you some good references in relationship to what's going on at this time. And Brother Conley specifically mentions the aspect of the removing of people from one land and the bringing in of people from other lands. Okay, Dale?
Just block it in my brain. Can you tell me the years between 2 Kings 15, 29, 30, and 2 Kings 17, 26, and verse 24? Yearly gap is it like 2 decades, or is it like 12 years, or what?
Are you talking about the first invasion?
15, 29, 30, the verse you gave. I remember the verses. And then you gave 17, 46. Is there like a 12-year gap, or 30-year gap, or what? Do you remember off the top of your head?
Okay, from the first invasion, there was 11 years. So, now then, as we come to verse 1, Tartan is not a proper name. It is a general. It would be like saying in the year that the general came to Ashdod, if we were using our terminology, or the commander-in-chief, or something like that. Although the true commander-in-chief is the president, so it's not really that. It would be the whoever's head of the armed forces. So it's the title of an office. That's who he's dealing with. The Tartan probably held the second position in the empire, which would be close to, I guess, our vice president, if you're trying to make a comparison, which is really not that close of a comparison, but trying to put it in our idea, our minds, it would be kind of like that. But he was second position in the empire. Ashdod is one of the 5 main cities of the Philistines. It was highly fortified. It is said that it stood a 29-year siege when retaken by the Egyptian Psammetichus. So to endure a 29-year siege, that's a long time. They were well fortified. But the reason Sargon sent this general to Ashdod is that Ashdod had to be taken in order to take Egypt, or in order to attack Egypt. It was thus the key to Egypt, and thus that's why he is sending his general there to take and fight against Ashdod. If they can't take Ashdod, there's no way of taking Egypt. That's just the way in which it was.
So what's the idea of that? Is that suggesting that they had a bunch of enemy soldiers and artillery locked up in Ashdod, and if they were to leave, then Ashdod could come in the 6th region? Is that the idea, or is some other reason?
Basically, the Assyrian army would have to go through that area where Ashdod is in order to go to Egypt. So, in order to get there, you have to go through them. So you have to defeat them first.
So it's like military technique, the way they acted in that day.
Well, it would be the same today. If you look at the World War II and trying to get to Japan, they didn't just immediately go attack Japan. They had to go from one island to another island to another island to another island. Why? Because all of those islands had to be defeated before you ever could get to Japan. So that's the same thing. You see that in any type of, if you're going to fight against a nation and there's a nation between you and it, you're going to have to take it. That's the same thing with this. And yet, Ashdod was a very well fortified city. And as I say, it was able to withstand a 29-year siege one time. Well, walls would not be the only thing. They also would have to have resources. As was mentioned by Brother Connolly, this is the only mention of Sargon in the Bible. He reigned from 722 to 705 BC. And this event would have been at 711 BC. Well, I can get one way there. In verse 2 then, at the same time spake the Lord by Isaiah the son of Amoz, saying, Go and loose the sackcloth from off thy loins, and put off thy shoe from thy foot. And he did so, walking naked and barefoot. It jumped on me more than I realized. Okay, thank you. Okay, there. Isaiah now is being instructed to remove his outer garments. It was a rough garment of sackcloth that was often worn by mourners. We see that many times in the Bible. They would put on sackcloth. Why? Because they were mourning. He's also told to remove his shoes and was to walk naked and barefoot. Now then, the word naked. We use it in a different way than the way in which they used it, in which the Bible uses it. When we talk about being naked, we mean totally without any clothing on. That's not the way in which the Bible uses it. The idea of nakedness in the Bible, and we're not going to go through a detailed study of this, but if you start in Genesis, and specifically chapter 3, what did Adam and Eve do after the sin, before they talked with God? Sewed fig leaves together to cover themselves. And I have a feeling those fig leaves that covered themselves probably were, I started to say larger, covered more than what the modern day swimming suits cover. And yet, when God comes in the cool of the evening, what does Adam say? We hid ourselves because I am because we were naked. They recognized that even though they had made these fig leaves, they were still naked. God made them what? Coats from animals to do what? To cover their nakedness. Those coats, and the Hebrew word basically indicates a covering from the shoulders to the knees. And so we start learning from God what He considers as being naked when you start uncovering that area. If we had time, we could also study the aspect of the priest. The priest were to wear undergarments that went down to the knees, so that if they were going upstairs, people could not see their nakedness. So again, we see confirmation of that same idea. There's other passages, but that's the idea that nakedness, or being naked, is presented in the Bible. It is not a total uncovering of the body. Here, Isaiah is removing his outer garment, and thus his inner garment is still on. He still has his inner garment on, but it still refers to it as walking naked and barefoot. His inner garment was called a tunic or a vest. If naked meant total nudity as we use the term, then there really would not have been the need to talk about walking naked and barefoot. Why would he need to add the barefoot if nakedness dealt with a total removing of all clothing? You would not need to add that. Also, this was to signify the carrying away into captivity. That was the purpose of it. Assyrians did not strip totally their captives. They did uncover certain areas, and thus later on in Isaiah, actually, we will see that they did that, and thus they are referred to as being naked when there was the uncovering of the thigh. But again, they did not totally strip their captives. Thus, the parallel would be that Isaiah was not totally naked or nude as we would think of it. Now then, that should teach us a lesson as to when we come into the New Testament, and it teaches us to dress in a modest way. And I just mention, kind of as an aside on this, that in 1 Timothy 2 and in 1 Peter 3, when it talks about the clothing and our need to be modest in our apparel, the problem there is in reality not underdress, but it is overdress in both of those passages. It would apply equally to underdress, but the specific problem that they were addressing was that of overdress. dressing in such an ostentatious way that it drew attention to the body. Now then, underdress would do the same thing, draw attention to the physical body. But we also need to consider God's view of nakedness. And when we consider God's view of nakedness, a whole lot of people today walk around naked from a biblical standpoint. You can't go to the store, to the mall, to just about any place without seeing people being naked. And I'm using the biblical definition of naked now, not our definition. We as Christians need to set a higher standard in our clothing, that we are exhibiting godliness, being like God, not dressing in such a way, whether overdress or underdress, doesn't matter, but not dressing in such a way as to draw attention to the physical body. That's not where the attention should be drawn. The attention should be drawn to our godliness, our morality, and we should be setting an example for the world. Problem is, we follow the example of the world and of Hollywood and the fashion designers instead of following the example of God. But that's another lesson. Here, Isaiah has removed his outer garment, his inner garment remains on, and he is thus walking naked and barefoot. And verse 3 says that the Lord said, like as my servant Isaiah hath walked naked and barefoot 3 years for a sign and wonder upon Egypt and upon Ethiopia. And I go ahead and read verse 4 as well. So shall the king of Assyria lead away the Egyptian prisoners and the Ethiopian captives, young and old, naked and barefoot, even with their buttocks uncovered, to the shame of Egypt. So that's getting both verses, but it is a symbolic action that's limited to 3 years by Isaiah. The purpose of what he's doing is given. It's a sign as to what Assyria is going to do to Egypt and Ethiopia for a 3-year time frame. Now then, understand the concept as well that Isaiah, he's not doing this so much for Egypt and Ethiopia. Why is he doing it then? For Israel. Because it was the tendency of Israel to run to Assyria or to run to Egypt to get help. If you run to Egypt to get help, why would you run to someone who Isaiah is now saying is going to be carried away captive for 3 years by the Assyrians? Kind of foolish to go to them, isn't it? Now that's Isaiah's point in this. You cannot rely upon Egypt and Ethiopia against the Assyrians. Notice, though, the title that God gives unto Isaiah. Like as my servant. What an honorable title that God gives unto Isaiah, my servant. There probably could be no greater compliment that could be given to anyone than for God to say, "This is my servant." God is recognizing Isaiah's service to him. But it shows a lot about the character and the nature of Isaiah. Isaiah was his servant. It recognizes that Isaiah is actively engaged in doing the will of the Lord. He's not just sitting on the sidelines as a cheerleader, encouraging someone. He's out there actually doing the work. And so God recognizes that. And Wayne Jackson noted about this in relationship to this phrase, "my servant," and in the context in which it's given. And he says, "One cannot but admire the obedient courage of Isaiah, who, for 3 years, endured the bitterness of the physical elements and doubtless the derision of his people in order to carry forth the divine message." And just think about this, of in that day someone going around with the outer clothes removed and only his, as we might refer to them, his undergarments on. How do you think that would go along, about today even? Think would have a little bit of ridicule, derision. And, I don't think, I could be wrong about this, but I don't think that they had the air conditioning and heating that we have today. They didn't have these HVAC units to cool themselves during the heat. And no, probably not. Even the portable fans. And so here, especially if it gets cold, you'd want to cover up a little bit more. That's generally the action that we take, isn't it? I mean, it gets down below 70 degrees here and people start wearing heavy coats. And that's not too much of an exaggeration, is it? And he's walking around in his, as we would put it, undergarments.
Feet would be very uncomfortable too, walking in the dirt and the rocks.
That's true. Think of having to walk around barefoot all the time. After a while, your feet would get toughened up a little bit, but still, it's going to be very painful. And I imagine there's going to be times in which you step on some thorns and some rocks. On a real sunny, hot day, sometime walk outside in your barefoot feet. And some of you have done that before, haven't you? And you're searching for some shade real quick. Especially if you got oak trees, that's going to cause a lot of pain as well. But the heat from the concrete and walking on that, Now then, saying all that to say Isaiah endured all of that for 3 years for this symbolic message to Israel: don't go seeking after the Egyptians and Ethiopians to find their help. And so when God says, my servant, think of that which Isaiah is enduring just for this symbolic message to Israel. And then it might mean a little bit more to us in our thinking that he really was enduring a lot. And he was doing God's service in enduring all of those things.
It doesn't say anything about it, but what do you think people would ask? What are you doing this for? Would you explain it?
I think it does not state specifically that, but why do it otherwise? I mean, if it's not going to make an impression upon people, and people just standing over there and ridiculing, there's got to be some message with it in order for them to get the message. He's got to be explaining something to people at times. There's no doubt people going to come up and ask him, why are you doing this? Yeah, it might be that. Are you crazy? So there's got to be some harmony there between just the action and people receiving the message. Dale?
Maybe it's not a necessary comment. I mean, look at all the signs that are used in the Bible, like in John 20 and 21. It don't really, it's kind of like a chain reference to make you think of it. God uses illustrations and parables and graphics a lot in the Bible to illustrate His will, miraculously as well as illustratively in parables and everything.
Well, there are numerous times in which symbolism like unto this is used. This was a common method of teaching by the prophets. Jesus' use of parables would not actually be, while it might be similar, it's not the same thing. Because a parable is just speaking something to the people that they are familiar with and drawing spiritual lessons from it. This is a action that Isaiah is doing that people see. And is for delivering a specific message to them. Carl?
Yeah, back then you didn't have a way to publicize what you were doing, and so that was a way for him to stand out among the crowd.
I think the key there is standing out among the crowd. It draws attention to him, and thus gives him the opportunity to deliver that message. I'm not sure with John the Baptist that just, I don't think that was to draw attention to himself, though, so much as just a comparison in relationship. He didn't live in the fine houses and the fancy stuff. His life was a life of ruggedness and difficulty. A mountain man? Okay. that would work. He's an outside person who wasn't dressed in fine clothing and the delicacies of this world.
Did Ezekiel get something like that acted out, all these things?
I believe so. There's several of the prophets who do that. Verse 4 then, as we read, so shall the king of Assyria lead away the Egyptian prisoners and the Egyptian captives, young and old, naked and barefoot, even with their buttocks uncovered, to the shame of Egypt. As we mentioned, the king here would probably be Sennacherib, and he was going to lead away the Egyptians and the Ethiopians in the most humiliating fashion that as Isaiah's symbolic actions demonstrated. Naked, barefoot, and with the buttocks uncovered. It was to a great intention the desire for these kings to humiliate the captives for the purpose of teaching others not to rebel, not to fight against them. According to the Pulpit Commentary, in Sennacherib's annals for the years BC 701, 12 years after this prophecy was given, we find the following passage. Quote, "The kings of Egypt and the archers, chariots, and horsemen of the king of Merio, a force without number, gathered and came to the aid of Ekron. In the neighborhood of Eltekeh, their ranks were arrayed before me, and they urged on their soldiers. In the service of Ashur, my lord, I fought with them, and I accomplished their overthrow. The charioteers and sons of the kings of Egypt and the charioteers of the king of Merio, alive in the midst of the battle, my hand captured," end quote. So we have basically a confirmation in Sennacherib's annals as to what we're seeing here and what Isaiah is prophesying here. Dale, you started to say, okay. So instead of going into verse 5, we'll stop there because I know Andrew's about to ring the second bell. And we'll start in verse 5 then, Lord willing, next week.